Good morning. Thank you all for being here. Can everyone at the back hear me? Okay, fantastic. Yeah, I'm really excited to be opening up this year's edition of Bode Electrons, and with today's topic, Composing with Found Sounds, the name is quite direct, gives you an idea, but it's also ambiguous, and that's on purpose. And I thought I'd start off with a quote by Lee Landy. That's from a paper he wrote about reviewing the musicology of electroacoustic music, a plea for greater triangulation, and it's from the 1999 edition of Organized Sound, and it reads, "Are the fields of sonic art and its musicology intentionally avoiding coherence? And why do musicologists of the music of notes continue to avoid the musicology of the music of sounds?" So I'm not going to attempt to answer that question because it's something that's been answered, I guess, progressively through times as the electroacoustic music field is growing and as more practitioners are bringing their work into a theoretical context through artistic research. So I thought the best way to explore a whole bunch of topics is through works that I'll be sharing with you, and particularly Mvuselelo, which means awakening in Xhosa. And this body of work was part of an installation about the intersection between South African culture and psychedelics and new ways of thinking and using the past to reimagine a future. So the works that I'll be looking at is one called Whistles Reimagined, and then the other one is Mega Memory. So just to start off, I just made a note there about the sound designer, and something that I found is interesting within working in, I guess, with film and multimedia is how sound design, collecting sounds and putting them together in the process that takes place is similar to composition as you'd find it with, say, Western classical music, or if you're working with notation, you're still thinking about motifs, harmonic structures, the rhythm, the flow of things. And when working with sound, you now have timbres, textures, and the quality and properties of the sounds themselves to work with. And to round things together, I'll be, just made a note there, referring back to James Andine's paper from 2014, called Sound and Narrative, and it's about acousmatic music as artistic research. And this is interesting because this bridges that gap of now you have practitioners who are now looking at how their practice intersects with the field and is exploring these themes. And just to familiarize everyone with a few terms that I'll be referring back to, the one is acousmatic music, and to give a bit of background, this goes back to in the 1940s and 50s, musique concrète, where Pierre Schaeffer started recording sounds and collaging them, in a sense. And a great thing to keep in mind is how, in that time, we now had technology enabling us to record, document sounds, and manipulate them in new and creative ways. And with that came working with tape, and I mean, you cut it, splice it, put it together, and create this collage of sounds. And now we have DAWs, which give us so many new avenues and ways of doing that. So as technology progresses, we're now given this opportunity to find new ways to transform sounds and work together. We're faced with this really amazing process of being able to reimagine. And so on the other end, I've got this second heading with found sounds and symbolism. With this next part and using the works, I'm going to refer to plunderphonics, which is it's a pretty good word, and that was coined by John Oswald in his paper about audio piracy and composition as prerogative. And that's a really great one because sampling is something that's been present in electronic music, especially hip-hop, and is a huge part of it in the creative process, but it's about the way you transform the sounds that differentiates whether it's plagiarism, piracy, or actually creative agency. So just to give an overview of the works I'll be speaking about. So Mvuselelo, in this first iteration, okay, so the Theatre of Beauty examines the connections between plant medicine, history, memory, and storytelling. the project draws on research on psychedelic and indigenous medicine practices and how they've been used to heal individuals, communities, and generational trauma. Mvuselelo is the first iteration of the Theatre of Beauty project. This iteration is presented in the form of an installation encompassing film, performance, found footage, and sound. So I'm going to be starting off with going through the mega memory session, just to talk about aspects like copyright, working with found sounds. What are these sounds being found? How are they collected? If they're not recorded, what is the responsibility of the person working with it to respect the intellectual property that already exists? So, okay, one sec. I'm going to be bouncing between a few different programs. So just before I dive in, I'm going to open this Audacity session. And I once had someone ask me why I still use Audacity when there's so many other DAWs. But the thing about Audacity, okay, firstly, it's open source. And the next thing is the way the process is streamlined helps with creating and working with so much media. Rather than diving into a session where I'm going to have 30 different tracks, I can now rather work with them individually, process them, and then take them through another round of processing. And why that's important is, with Mega Memory, there's this aspect of found footage. So the visual artist was working with collecting a lot of media that was present in the early 2000s on the SABC channels and all the adverts and jingles that we used to also hear on radio in that time. And linked to psychedelics, this was to speak about collective memory and how even though we all have individual experiences, there's also shared experiences through the media that we consumed and also what was available. Also looking at with the SABC channels and the different languages that they had, which viewers are more likely to be watching which channels, how are those channels racialized, and exploring concepts like that. So with collecting this information, also with something that's important to keep in mind with an installation, and with, even though one is composing, one needs to keep the audience and the receivers of that information in mind. It's one thing to write something, but it's another thing to actually keep whoever's going to be perceiving that in mind, taking their experience into account. So for data collection, or trying to make sure I covered as much as possible in terms of the media that would be used for the sound aspect of Mega Memory, I went through like old magazines of what would screen at which times, what times were kids most likely to get back from school, when families were together from, let's say, 5 p.m., when everyone's back from work, what's being shown. And also looking at YouTube comments, things like Isidingo, Sievandala, and Generations. Those were like sound bits I had to put in. So with this session, there were a bunch of recordings I found on YouTube, because there are a lot of people thinking about this shared memory and nostalgia, what did we work with in the past. And I found a bunch of montages, and another thing that's important is to look at what, let's say, copyright type is assigned to the works. Like with YouTube, you'll find they say some things are in the public domain, or the type of copyright that's related to it. So it's working with something like this. These are bits of music that have been created by composers themselves. And in a process like this, where I'm taking it, I can't just paste it, and even though I'm putting it together, say it's my work, because that is just blatant plagiarism. And why it's important to keep the elements of music in mind is because that helps with the process of transforming the work that's going to take place. So with something like this, it'll be like changing the rhythm, meter, pitch, tempo, reversing it, stretching it out, chopping it up into little bits, and trying to think of how many possibilities there are to really recreate the work, because that is when it becomes the process of transformation, when it is now adapted. And a really good thing to look at is to familiarize oneself with the South African Copyright Act, because in one sense, this work wouldn't be it would be a cinematographic work, and each different type of, let's say, creative output that is copyrighted is treated differently based on what it is classified as. And being aware of this can also actually aid the creative process. So with these clips, this was a video that I'd gotten that had a montage of a lot of the sounds I was looking for and wanted to work with. And for example here, it's the Isidingo theme, but I've slowed it down quite a lot. And then this is the part with the saxophone. But I've cut out a lot of the frequency spectrum. And it sounds quite thin, and that was done on purpose because now I have to go find another work to layer it with that is going to complement it in order to keep it a coherent piece of sound as the piece progresses. So Audacity is great because as you work with these clips, and this is actually a trick Meryl showed me many years ago, you can label them and actually export these individual segments of sound as they are in the time frame allocated. So from this, I did this with a whole lot of clips and put it into, where is it? Just one moment. Technology, always finicky. This montage that is over here, and this specific session, also something to bear in mind as a sound designer is, you can be attached to your work, but only to a certain degree, because as soon as there are visuals involved, it's going to have to change to adapt to that, because our brains are just wired in this age of visual culture to want to create meaning to what we're seeing, making sure those layers work together, and that the visuals and the sounds are complementing each other. So this was a version just before the final one that had these clips together, and I'll play a few segments.
There's no kimura in the fridge.
It's not inside, it's on...
It's not inside, it's on.
All right. So yeah, there's a snippet of Mega Memory. And something that was very tricky with this is in the previous version, there was a lot more sounds layered and put together. And also with that aspect of copyright in mind, it's a safe bet if you are taking something to rather use, I'd say, a minimum of 5 seconds, just so there's recognition, but less than 10 seconds. So it's also picking the segments that it's sort of like, what is going to jog memory? What is going to also emulate that psychedelic experience where you are recalling something, but it is different? Are you remembering the things you didn't know you forgot? And it is sort of to jog that kind of process. So with, I'd mentioned plunderphonics and how sampling is not something that just happens in electronic music. I actually found this example of Berio's Sinfonia, which in the YouTube, I just screenshotted this YouTube comment of all the works that that he borrowed from. And this is done with the artistic intention of, he wanted to make social commentary about the political climate at the time, media, and all of that. And it was just really great to see that this has also taken place in other contexts. And I found this paper by Michael Hicks, where you can see it actually goes and picks out which motifs are used from which works. And what's interesting is when you're going to layer compositions like that, and as I think it was Stravinsky who said, good composers don't imitate, they steal. And with these segments, you're going to have to transpose them, change them, just to make sure that it actually works together in a coherent manner. And that's very similar to what actually takes place when working with samples and putting sound collages together. So I'm going to move on to Whistles Reimagined. And this is a great way for the other part I was going to speak about how sounds as objects carry symbolism, and just in terms of working with sound in a space and the space in which that sound was recorded, what does that sound carry presently, historically, what is the context of it, what are the properties of it, but also I like to think sounds have identities, and what identity does that sound hold, also based on the environment that it existed in and where it's being replicated. So with Whistles Reimagined, how Whistles came about in this installation is there were various components a part of it, and a common thread that Koleka Potuma found was that there were whistles present. And to speak to that, the common denominator in all the examples of whistling is that of communication by human beings with either fellow human beings or animals. In this case of communication with animals, whistles usually have only a limited function as commands, while in the case of communication with fellow humans, it conveys meaning. It has also been established that one whistle can be applied to more than one situation, just like certain words which have more than one meaning in a language. And with the brief, before we started conceptualizing all of this, actually given the examples of, in South Africa, we see the presence of whistles at Groove, so that would be a party, online and dancing challenges in Dlombe, and also in church. And what was interesting was, I was familiar with all of these examples that were given, but whistles in church was something that was foreign to me. I think, having been raised Catholic. And that also prompted me to think about, okay, if I'm not familiar with this, what other instances in our lives do we hear whistles? It might be in the street when you're with calling taxis. It might be a wolf whistle when you're walking in the street. It could be a whistling kettle, signaling that, okay, now you can go make your tea. There are so many instances of whistles in everyday life, and to begin this project, it was thinking of who hears whistles, where do we hear them, how does the context of the whistles you hear differ depending on who you are. And so with sourcing whistles, there was the challenge of, because whistles at Groove was also a dominant theme, it's very hard for me to take my Zoom recorder and now go to a club and try look for moments where people are going to be whistling or have an actual physical whistle to while amapiano is playing. There's a lot of factors to take into account. And I'd been asked why I didn't just find people who could do the kind of whistling that would go with amapiano, and I wanted the sound to be as authentic as possible. It's very hard to recreate a joyful partying experience in a studio space. It can be done in ways, but what I rather did was went and found TikToks and videos, because recently there's an amapiano whistler who had gone viral. So I try to find as many of these as possible and then extract the sound itself. And with this process of extraction, RX is a really great program for, initially I was introduced to it for audio restoration, but it's also fantastic for just working with sound in general, because there's many possibilities. So I found these clips, and let's see, just to play, this was one of the whistlers. And it would be, just give an example, oops, sorry, sitting for hours and let's say, selecting, wrong command, selecting the right frequencies. And I'm not going to do that now, just to, so, and that became, so just lots of different whistles. Also wanted to have short segments, long segments, some that are still quite distorted. And as you can see from the response in the room, something to bear in mind when putting this installation together was that whistles are something that occupy a very high range of the frequency spectrum. And our ears are very sensitive, especially around 3K. And now, if there are going to be people walking into this space, also because it's a tunnel, or the way the venue, it's a tunnel that you walk into, also taking into account the acoustics of the space. So even though I wasn't physically there, it's thinking that, okay, there are whistles that are in a high range. There needs to be something in the lower frequency range that is going to ground and hold people while there are all these whistles going on. And because of that and the psychedelic aspect, I processed some of these whistles to make them sound like drones, like a sitar, but not exactly. So just to get into that session, logic needs a moment. All right. So everything that is here, the only sounds that aren't whistles are 3 sounds that are this artificial heartbeat that I decided to use a heartbeat. Koleka had initially wanted a drum, but I thought that as symbolic as drums are, I don't want to feed into this idea of African tribalism in a disrespectful sense, and we could rather imagine or think of our heartbeats as our own somatic or internal drums. And the next one was this gong sound, or it's not a gong actually, it's called ancient gong, but I was looking for a sound that captured ancientness and meditation or meditative space. And one of the reasons why I use Logic specifically is because of the 2 things, the Alchemy sound library and the space designer that is built into Logic. And Ableton is a fantastic program for sound design, but in terms of what I wanted to achieve, and generally with working with visual media, I find Logic beneficial to my process. So when putting Whistles Reimagined together, initially it was meant to be a standalone sound installation, but there was also that challenge of, within the piece, or all these works that were part of the installation, this visual work that is about the mushroom dancer, a performer as a mushroom, embodying the psychedelic process of awakening, in terms of there is a calling, there's ego death that takes place, and post or after that, integration needs to happen. And I thought that if there's going to be a video of someone doing movement, we naturally want to assign sounds or music or a source to that. And I decided that the whistle installation should be grounded or attached to that movement piece. And before this, I had, with the whistles I collected, tried to put them together to create sound motifs that carry different meanings, different types of energy, have different textures, and could be placed in time to show this process. So just to give an example of some of the motifs. So that's quite a short one. And just as, I guess with working with pitch, when you have a motif, you might, what is the word? Embellish some of the notes, retrograde, reverse them, add harmonies. But in this case, they aren't distinct harmonies because there are a lot of sounds that are being transformed and put together. And so with the whistles that were turned into drones, I'm just going to find one. Let's see. Also the naming of these tracks, the ones that are left and right. Another aspect with, let's say, sound design and is space. Space is such an important element with, I guess, electroacoustic music in general because of music initially being played off loudspeakers, and how the space itself also interacts with the work because of the acoustics. And when there's no physical source that the sound is being created from, one is challenged to actively listen. So with the drone whistles, this was using Logic Space Designer and working with the what can I call it? Properties to get that whistle sound. So that's actually quite quiet. Let me see. So that is it without without the space designer. And that was also, with the drones, was also a way of calming the whistles to ground them, bring it together, so that this can be quite an embodied experience rather than it bombarding the listener. So just some other motifs. And with the placement and the rhythms that I used, it was also to recall the uhadi and qualities that you'd find in certain indigenous instruments. So I'm running quite short on time, but the dancing mushroom, or this whole piece, will be played as part of the compositions. Just two more layerings of whistles. All right, so that is a quick look at Whistles Reimagined. Thank you. Thank you, thank you.
Magnificent, Denise. Thank you so much. Are there questions from the audience?
I have one question about the term psychedelic.
Yes.
I'm not aware of the moment in time when it changed to become a description of the music process. My days.
Yeah.
So I'm curious.
I think that's an interesting question, and I think actually, so linked to plunderphonics and that notion of like transforming sounds, there's a plunderphonic artist named, I think it's Oniotrix Neverpoint, and he said working with sounds in that way is actually quite a psychedelic process. So I'd say the process in itself is quite psychedelic. changing these sounds, morphing them, transforming them, and then putting them together. And it's quite meditative as well. Thank you.
Really lovely stuff. I really like the listening stuff. A little bit intense ideas. But it reminds me of Eric Clark's work on ecological listening, right? Where he sort of says that we listen in a way that sound has certain kind of ecological affordances. If you whistle, if the kettle whistles, it tells you it's time for tea. And why don't we use that example as well? But I'm wondering whether there's not something around that engenders a sense of the psychedelic, where the environment, the sense of perception of sound, that the act of listening ecologically is changed in your music, where you're kind of disrupting what the ecology should be that we're hearing. Is there something a little bit psychedelic about that? Like when you're on LSD and the wall moves, how is the wall moving acoustically here?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm just like processing it. Just to speak to acoustic ecology first, something I found quite interesting was also thinking about what in nature or in our acoustic environments naturally exists that sounds like whistle, birds. So in the beginning I was trying to make it sound like birds having a conversation, but also just in how it's such a strange object to be hearing that is quite psychedelic. And I guess it's good to hear that because it means that in this process the whistles themselves have embodied that psychedelic aspect. Yeah, that shifting of reality.
And if I may cut in, I know Denise's work well enough to, this sounds rather abstract, but to understand that she's composing with the composition process. So there's a lot happening behind the scenes, articulated through sound, that have been molded to your requirements. But what I find fascinating about her work that I've observed over a number of years, the development in her creative work over the last couple of years, is this acute sense of, yeah, I'm a composer, but I can also compose with the environment within which I am composing a piece of music. And yeah, that's a really beautiful I'm a little bit jealous, I have to admit. Any further questions? Denise, magnificent. Thank you so much
Thank you,
for
Theo.
coming back.
And thank you all. I hope you enjoy the rest of Bode Electrons, and it has been a pleasure to kickstart it.